In 1858, New York set out to build a landscape that had never existed on 843 acres of swamp and rock in Manhattan. And on the day the work began, there was no soil that would hold a lawn, no drain for the water, and no machine on site that could move the rock except powder and horses. So the city blasted. By Frederick Law Olmsted's own accounting, it took 260 tons of gunpowder. But the man who mapped every foot of that ground was fired before most of it went off. His name was Egbert Ludovicus Viele. He was the park's chief engineer, and in September of 1857, the commissioners hired Olmsted to work underneath him. 7 months later, Olmsted had his job, and in 1864, Viele took him to court. That is the strange, improvised, deeply human story of how Central Park was actually built. But the most important piece of equipment in that park was not the gunpowder, and it was not the 95 miles of clay pipe buried under the grass. It was 4 roads that almost nobody notices. 33 plans were entered in the design competition. 32 of them left those roads on the surface. 1 plan buried all 4, and that single decision is the reason Central Park is a park today, and not 5 separate lots with traffic running between them. We spent weeks pulling this story together, and it is one of the most overlooked engineering feats in American history. Stay with us, because we are going to walk that ground, machine by machine, from the swamp at the bottom to a courtroom at the end. And by the end, you will understand why the real wonder of Central Park is not that it was designed, but that it was built at all with the tools of the 1850s. Manhattan, 1856. Mayor Fernando Wood needed an engineer who could tell the city what it had actually bought, and he gave the job to a West Point graduate and Mexican War veteran who spent the next months walking that ground on foot. What Viele found up there was not parkland. It was low, wet, and broken. Swamps sat in the hollows. Bare ridges of Manhattan schist ran through it. Pig farms and bone-boiling works and squatters' shanties sat on the parts that drained. Viele wrote that the site was, in his words, a pestilential spot, where rank vegetation and miasmatic odors taint every breath of air. And then he looked at the rock and wrote something any engineer would recognize. To alter them would be desecration, and to erase them, folly. Hold on to that word, miasmatic. It matters in about 10 minutes. So he mapped it, every stream, every spring, every ridge, on foot, with a survey crew. And then he drew a plan, and when the first annual report went to print in 1857, that plan appeared with a heading saying, "The commissioners had adopted it." They had not. According to the historians of the Olmsted Papers, the plan was never formally adopted at all, and the claim went on the page regardless. Then, in September of 1857, the commissioners hired a superintendent to run the labor gangs. He was a failed farmer from Staten Island with a bad leg and a magazine career behind him. He had never built anything. He reported to Viele. And this is where it turns, because the board started routing work around its own chief engineer. They asked the superintendent to write reports. They asked him about drainage. They asked him about planting. Viele was still chief engineer on paper, and on the ground his own subordinate was quietly becoming the man the board talked to. In October of 1857, the board announced a public design competition. Calvert Vaux, an English-born architect, had been telling anyone who would listen that Viel's plan was unimaginative, and he pushed hard for that competition to happen. Then he asked the superintendent to enter it with him. Picture it from Viel's side. You survey the ground. You publish the plan. The city hires a man to work for you, then runs a contest to replace your plan, and your own employee enters that contest against you, teamed up with the architect who has been calling your work unimaginative around town. In April of 1858, the entry called Greensward won. Viele was kept on just long enough to finish the surveys nobody else could finish, and then he was dismissed. He did not take it quietly, but what he did about it took 6 years to reach a courtroom, and we are going to come back to it, because it is the last thing that happens in this story. If you are the kind of person who suspects the man who gets fired is sometimes the man who was right, hit the like button now, because that question runs underneath everything we are about to walk through. The clearing had already started. In late August of 1857, before any of the winning plans existed, crews were putting up fences, cutting vegetation, draining ground, and leveling terrain. By September, Viele reported nearly 700 men on the payroll, and the first job those men had was to empty the land of the people living on it. Roughly 1,600 people lived inside what would become the park, and they were not all in one place. There were Irish shanty clusters near McGowan's Pass at the north end, small farms near York Hill, scattered homesteads across the middle. Most of those people are gone from the record entirely. They had no deeds worth arguing over, so the clearing crews went through, and the paper stops. We can tell you how many there were, and that is the end of what anybody can tell you about them. And on the west side, between what is now 82nd and 89th Street, there was a village. On September 27, 1825, a 25-year-old black bootblack named Andrew Williams bought 3 lots of that ground from John and Elizabeth Whitehead for $125. The same day, a man named Epiphany Davis bought 12 lots for $578, and the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church bought 6. That was the start of Seneca Village. By its peak, it held roughly 225 people, 3 churches, a school, and 2 burial grounds. Remember the burial grounds? It was mostly free black New Yorkers, and that mattered in a very specific and very American way, because New York required a black man to own $250 in property before the state would let him vote. Owning ground in that village was how a man got a ballot. According to the historian Roy Rosenzweig, of the 100 black men eligible to vote in New York State in 1845, 10 of them lived in Seneca Village, 10% of the black electorate of an entire state, standing on one hillside. And here is the part most tellings leave out. According to the Central Park Conservancy, Irish and German immigrants lived up there too, and some of them rented their houses from black landlords. In 1850s Manhattan. Then the city took it, and it took it legally. Eminent domain, the same instrument a city uses today, commissioners assigning a value to your property, and a check arriving whether you agree with the number or not. Williams was paid $2,335 for his house and his 3 lots. He had asked $3,500. He lost the argument, and he took the check, and he left. Sit with the arithmetic, because it cuts both ways. Williams paid $125 in 1825 and walked away with $2,335. On paper, that is a return most people would take. And it was still more than $1,000 under what he said his home was worth. And there was no version of that transaction where he got to stay. Renters got nothing at all. A New York Times writer of the period put the city's motive in a single line, and it is a hard line. The sole object of the authorities in making the park, he wrote, is to procure their expulsion from the homes which they occupy. The buildings came down. The foundations were pulled apart. And what the ground kept, it kept quietly. When archaeologists dug test pits at the site in 2011, According to the Conservancy, what came up was not a shanty town. It was an iron tea kettle, a roasting pan, a stoneware beer bottle, fragments of Chinese export porcelain, and a child's shoe with the leather sole and part of the upper still intact. 14 years after the last house came down, diggers came back to that corner of the park for a completely unrelated reason, and the ground answered. We will get to what they found. Now, the swamp. Because you cannot grow a meadow on standing water, and in August of 1857, the board hired a 24-year-old agricultural engineer named George E. Waring, Jr. to deal with it. Waring had entered the design competition too. His plan lost, and then he stayed and drained the park for the men who beat him, which tells you how much of this project ran on people swallowing things. Now that word from earlier, miasmatic. Waring was a miasmatist, he believed, as Viele did, and as a great many educated men did in 1857, that disease rose out of wet ground as bad air. Germ theory was still decades away from winning that argument. So Waring drained this park because he thought the wetness itself was going to kill people. And he was wrong about that. And it did not matter in the slightest, because the thing he built to solve a problem that did not exist turned out to be the finest drainage system in the country. It was clay tile pipe, laid end-to-end in trenches, with no joints and no cement holding it. Water pushed up between the seams from below and ran away downhill. According to the landscape historian Catherine Sievert Nordenson, the trenches ran 3 feet deep in the open glades and 4 feet deep in wooded ground, and they were cut at intervals of roughly 40 feet across the entire site, including the ground that was already dry. The total, according to the account by Rick Burns and James Sanders, came to 95 miles of underground pipe. 95 miles. That is a pipe run longer than the drive from Manhattan to Philadelphia, buried under a park, on a project most people file under gardening. Olmsted called it the best work of the kind in the world, and the New York Public Library still holds Waring's own drainage map, dated December 31st, 1858, with the lines already inked across the lower half of the park. Here is what that means for anyone who has ever walked across the sheep meadow. That lawn is not sitting on ground. It is sitting on a machine. The reason the grass is dry is that a 24-year-old who lost the competition ran clay pipe under all of it, and 168 years later, a great deal of that pipe is still doing its job. But you cannot lay pipe through rock. And the middle of Manhattan is rock, which is a problem for a drainage engineer, and a much larger problem for the 4 roads that were about to eat this entire budget. If this is the kind of engineering you came here for, subscribe now, because the next section is the one that shook the windows on Fifth Avenue. In 1859, a New York lawyer named George Templeton Strong sat near the park and wrote in his diary about the noise. And what he wrote is the strangest detail in this whole story, because the blasting was not an inconvenience. It was an attraction. The early guidebooks printed the schedule. People came uptown to watch. Strong described it like this. They were all around us for some 20 minutes, he wrote, now booming far off to the north, now quite near, now distant again, like some desultory affair between advanced posts of 2 great armies. That is a man describing his own city being shelled and having a nice afternoon. The total, by Olmsted's own calculation, was 260 tons of gunpowder. You will also see 166 tons quoted very often, including on Wikipedia, and we are not going to pretend the sources agree, because they do not. What we can say is that the higher figure is the one the engineer in charge worked out himself. And hold that figure against the 4 roads we mentioned at the top, because most of that powder was not spent making the park pretty. It was spent digging 4 trenches nobody was ever supposed to look at. And the 2 historians who wrote the standard book on this park, Roy Rosenzweig and Elizabeth Blackmar, set that tonnage next to something else. They wrote that more gunpowder went into those rocky ridges than was later fired at the Battle of Gettysburg. We want to be careful with that one, because it is a historian's comparison and not a ballistics calculation, and we have not seen anybody show the arithmetic. Take it as the flourish it is still the kind of flourish that sticks, because the direction of it is right. By the first day of 1862, the commissioner's own figures put the count at 2 million cubic yards of earth removed and 250,000 cubic yards of solid rock excavated. 4 years, black powder, hand drills, sledgehammers, derricks, horses. And we want to be precise about hand drills, because the phrase does most of the work and none of the explaining. There was no practical steam rock drill in America in 1858. So every hole that took a charge on that site was cut by 2 men. One kneels and holds a steel rod against the rock and turns it a few degrees. The other swings a sledge at the end of it. Turn, swing, for however long it takes to get a couple of feet into solid schist. Then the foreman packs the powder. Everybody walks away, and the guidebooks tell the tourists what time to show up. So who was holding the steel? At peak, according to the commissioner's figures, 3,666 men worked that site at one time, and the average daily force across a year ran around 3,000. Over the whole project, more than 20,000 men passed through. They were mostly Irish immigrants and the sons of Irish immigrants, with Germans, some Italian stonecutters, and Yankee engineers sitting on top. There were no black laborers on the park. There were no women. According to Burns and Sanders, black workers were kept off deliberately to avoid trouble with the Irish. So the same city that cleared a black village to build this park then refused to let black men earn $1 building it. That was the policy, deliberately, in writing. And that $1 is the number to hold on to. A day laborer on Central Park made about $1 a day. A stonecutter, by 1860, made $2.25. And a blasting foreman, the man who decided where the charge went and how much powder went in it, made an extra 25 cents a day for it. 25 cents. That is what the city priced that decision at. Olmsted did not romanticize them either. He described the men he was hiring as coming from what he called the poorest, or what is generally considered the most dangerous, class of the great city's population. That is the superintendent of Central Park describing his own workforce. By the standard accounts, 5 men died building it. 5 across 15 years, with 260 tons of powder, no hard hats, and no rules. And we want to be honest about the shape of that number. It gets repeated everywhere, and we could not pin it to a page in a primary source, so treat it as the received figure rather than a hard one. What we can tell you is that we are not going to give you their names, because we do not have their names. Nobody wrote them down. 20,000 men came through that ground, and the annual reports counted the cubic yards every single year. The powder broke the rock. Something still had to carry it out. The total, and this is Olmsted's figure again, was 4,825,000 cubic yards of stone and earth moved. He was proud enough of that to do the conversion himself, and the way he put it is better than anything we could write. It was, in his words, nearly 10 million ordinary city one-horse cart loads, which in single file would make a procession 30,000 miles in length. 30,000 miles. He is describing a line of carts that wraps the planet and keeps going. Those 20,000 men do not have a monument anywhere in that park. If you think a number like that should have names attached to it, hit like. And we will keep pulling these men out of the annual reports for as long as you keep watching. And the traffic ran both directions, because what was underneath was useless. It would not grow anything. So 18,500 cubic yards of topsoil came in by cart and barge from New Jersey and Long Island, along with more than 46,000 cubic yards of manure and compost to feed the planting. 6 million bricks, 65,000 cubic yards of gravel, all of it landing on a site with no rail, no truck, and no paved road into it. Then they had to move the trees, and this is the one piece of real machinery in the story, so we want to name it correctly, because the internet gets this wrong. You will see it called Olmsted's tree-moving machine. It was designed by an engineer named John Y. Collier, and it was a huge horse-drawn wooden rig that could lift a mature tree with its root ball intact, carry it across the site, and set it down somewhere else. The best documented figures for what it could do come from Brooklyn, at Prospect Park, so we are not going to hand you those as Central Park numbers. But that machine is why mature trees stand in a park that was bare rock a decade earlier. Steam engines were on the ground, too. Beyond that, the honest answer is that itemizing every crusher and derrick means going through the commissioner's annual reports page by page. And we did not get to the bottom of that. What we can tell you is the shape of the thing. Horses, powder, hand drills, and about 3,000 men a day for 15 years. And here is where this project stops resembling any construction site you have ever seen. Because in the winter of 1859, with the north end still under powder and roughly 3,000 men still on the payroll, the park opened. It was nowhere near finished, and they opened it anyway. The lower section had water in it. The water froze, and thousands of New Yorkers came uptown with skates. They skated on ground that had been a swamp 4 years earlier and a blasting range that same summer, and the guidebooks that printed the skating conditions were the same guidebooks printing the blasting schedule. It is worth sitting with how strange that is. Imagine a city today opening half a construction site to the public on a Sunday, while the other half is still being detonated on a timetable and advertising both. That is what New York did. And it worked, because once thousands of people had skated on it, cutting the park in half stopped being something a board of aldermen could do quietly. Now we come back to the 4 roads, because everything you have just watched was in service of them. The competition rules were specific. Any plan had to carry 4 public roads straight across the park, east to west, so the city could get through. At 65th Street, at 79th, at 86th, at 97th. That was not a suggestion. It was a requirement, and it was the hardest problem in the brief. Think about what a crosstown road does to a park. Manhattan is a grid. The park runs 51 blocks north to south. Cut 4 public roads through it at ground level, and you have not built a park. You have built 5 strips of grass with traffic between them, and the illusion dies at every crossing. 33 plans came in. 32 of them left those roads on the surface. According to the Central Park Conservancy, the Greensward Plan was the only submission that sank all 4 below the grade of the park. That is it. That is the whole trick. And the price of it was most of the budget and most of the powder, because sinking a road 8 feet into Manhattan means blasting a trench clean across the island 4 separate times, then walling both sides of the cut in stone, then bridging over the top so the park can walk across and never look down. Olmsted and Vaux had a word for what they had built. They called them subways. That is decades before New York had anything of the kind, and they were describing a road for horses and carts running in a cut underneath a lawn. At the 79th Street crossing, they hit Vista Rock, the ridge Belvedere Castle stands on, and the only way through was to tunnel and blast. That cut dates to around 1860, and the rock faces alongside that transverse still carry the drill scars. You can put your hand on them. Then the bridges. 11 of them cross over the transverse roads, and across the park, there are 36 arches and bridges in total, no two of them alike. People assume that is decoration, and it is the opposite of decoration. Every one of those bridges had to carry a different path over a different cut at a different angle, so every one of them had to be redesigned from scratch. 11 crossings, 11 engineering problems, 11 answers. And the sunken roads were only the bottom layer, because Olmsted and Vaux stacked 4 separate circulation systems on top of each other. The transverse roads at the bottom, in the cut. The carriage drives above them. The bridle paths for horseback riding, and the footpaths for people walking. 4 networks crossing the same 843 acres, and the arches are what let them cross each other without ever meeting. The drive goes over. The path goes under. Nobody stops. We should say the honest part about that, too, because the layers did not only separate traffic. In 1860, a carriage was not something a man on $1 a day owned. So the system that kept the horses off the walkers also, in practice, kept the rich and the poor from sharing a path. Here is the payoff, and you can test it yourself next time you are in New York. Stand on the Bow Bridge. Look around. There are cars crossing the park at 4 separate points within a few hundred yards of you, and you cannot see one of them, and you cannot hear most of them. The park has been swallowing crosstown traffic since before the Civil War ended, and the reason the illusion of wilderness holds has almost nothing to do with the trees. It is a hole in the ground that 32 other architects did not think to dig. That is what you are looking at when you look at Central Park. Not a garden that survived the city, a machine that hides it. If you have watched anything else about this park, you have never been told that, and that is the reason this channel exists. Subscribe, and we will keep taking the monuments apart machine by machine. There is one more object in the middle of the park that nobody designed, and it explains a lot about the shape of the place. The city had already built a rectangular water reservoir up there in 1842, years before there was a park, as part of the Croton system that finally gave New York clean water. When the park was approved, that reservoir did not move. The people moved. The reservoir stayed, because water was the one thing inside that footprint the city could not afford to lose. And then, while the park was going up around it, the city built a second one. The new reservoir went in between 1858 and 1862, covering 106 acres, roughly 40 feet deep, holding over 1 billion gallons. It is still there. It is the one runners circle today. So the park was under construction, and at the same time, 1 billion-gallon waterworks was under construction inside it, and both crews were working the same ground in the same years. Which brings us to money. And money is where the design team came apart. The competition had been advertised with a budget of $1.5 million. The land alone had cost the city $7.39 million, which was more than the United States would pay Russia for Alaska 9 years later. And the finished park came in around $14 million. The man holding that line was Andrew Haswell Green, the comptroller. Green did his job, which is the polite way of saying he audited every request Olmsted made, questioned the cost of every planting, and turned the money down to a trickle. And we are going to say the unpopular thing, because this story usually gets told with Green as the villain and Olmsted as the artist. Look at the numbers again. Advertised at 1.5 million, delivered at 14. That is roughly 9 times the figure, in public money, during a civil war. Somebody had to be the man who said no, and Green was the man who said no, and the park still got built while the country was tearing itself apart. So we are not going to hand you Green as the small-minded bookkeeper. Without him, there is no park here to argue about. He was also, by every account, impossible to work for. By 1862, Olmsted was finished. He resigned and left for California. Vaux resigned in 1863. The 2 men who beat 32 other plans and buried 4 roads under a park had lost the argument to an accountant, and most of the park was completed without them. In April of 1870, William M. Tweed took the park. He rewrote the commission, cut it from 11 members down to 5, and packed it with Tammany men. Olmsted and Vaux resigned again that year, rather than work for it. When Tweed's accounts blew open in public in 1871, they came back. And in that same year, 1871, a work crew was digging up trees near 85th Street and 8th Avenue. That is the corner of the park where Seneca Village had stood. 14 years after the last house came down, the diggers hit coffins. The Roy Rosenzweig Center for History and New Media records what came out of that ground. One held an Irish girl named Margaret McIntay. The other held a man, described in the report of the day as decomposed beyond recognition, and nothing more than that. 2 burial grounds had been in that village. The city had cleared the buildings. It had not cleared the graves. We are not going to editorialize on that. We will just leave the sequence where it sits. In 1857, the city paid Andrew Williams $2,335 and told him to go. In 1871, his neighbors came back up through the lawn. That is the ground under the park. Here is what came out of it. In 1873, the last piece of the original design went in. At the center of the terrace, a bronze angel rose over a fountain. The Angel of the Waters, by a sculptor named Emma Stebbins, and it commemorates the arrival of clean water in a city that used to die of cholera. It was the only sculpture in the original plan, and Stebbins was the first woman in New York City ever awarded a major public commission. So the park was done. Some sources will give you 1876 for the full build-out, and that is defensible too. But by 1873, the water was running, the angel was up, and the ground was doing what it had been built to do. Which leaves Viele. He sued in 1864. He charged that Olmsted and Vaux, along with everybody else who entered that competition, had stolen his plan. According to the papers of Frederick Law Olmsted, Vaux stood in a New York courtroom and vigorously rebutted the accusation, and the record we could reach ends right there. What the record does not show us, and we are not going to invent it for you, is who won. We looked hard. You will find people online who will tell you Viele collected a settlement, and we could not find a source for that, so we are not going to repeat it. But here is what is not in dispute. In 1865, Viele made another map, and this one covered the whole island. It shows every stream, every marsh, every spring that Manhattan had paved over, drawn by the man who had walked that ground on foot back when it was still wet. And that map never went away. Today, when a contractor in Manhattan is about to put a foundation into the ground, one of the documents they pull is the Viele map. The New York Public Library, which holds it, says outright that architects and contractors still use it to make sure they are not building over a buried waterway. The New York Times wrote about it in 2006. It is 161 years old, and it is still in the workflow because the water is still down there, and Viele is the man who wrote down where. He lost the park. He lost his job to his own assistant. He lost, as far as we can tell, in court. And his map is the one thing on that entire island nobody has managed to build over.